Good morning, St. Andrews. Well, last week we had the privilege of celebrating Easter, the epic story of God restoring. And it was wonderful to have some of the story presented by Casey. Wasn't he great when he came up here and so dramatically presented to us part of the story? I thought he did such a great job that I decided not to use notes for most of my time this morning. So I saw him this morning and I said, "Wow, you really raised the bar last week." He said, "Dan, you'll be fine." And then we had Barbara's story. I was on the edge of tears for most of the time she was telling her story. I think most of you probably were too. She explained how the difficult start to her life and the early life that she had, which had so much struggle, caused her to one day call out to God, and He came and He answered her prayer. And she said that even in her experience with Christ, there was a lot of struggle and suffering, but that it was worth it. Isn't that true? What a story, what an inspiration that we heard last week, Barbara. Thank you. And before we get into the story of the Emmaus Road and how it is part of the larger story of Easter and the larger story of God in our world, I want to just talk about story for a moment. Story is one of the ways in which we are impacted. It's why we love books and movies. It's why we want to or like to hear stories from our friends and tell stories to others. In fact, story goes to the very deepest part of our soul and our body. The Bible is actually considered by some a story. It's actually many stories, and they're all part of revealing God's larger story or narrative to us. It's not like some people think, merely a list of do's and don'ts. There might be some lists of do's and don'ts in the larger narrative of God, but it's not mostly about that. And it's not a systematic theology by which we understand everything about religion, but it's a story that goes deep to the very heart of our hearts and explains who God is, what this life is all about, why it's so hard, and where it's going. And we have stories, our own personal stories, that sometimes we find very difficult. And this morning, I think through the Emmaus Road account, we can see how our stories can be restoried and fit into God's larger story. And sometimes I'll use story or narrative as if they mean nearly the same thing. And to understand why these are so important and how they can move things in the world, I'd like to start with what we're seeing today in the news so much, which is concerning our hearts in the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, there's a war going on. It is not merely a battle between armies with weapons. Who has the more powerful? Who can be in a place first to shoot the first bullet? It is certainly that. But this is a story of two or more narratives, big ideas about what the world is. On the one hand, we have Putin. And I don't know him. I don't know his mind. I'm only getting my stories from where you do, from the news. But it seems like he has a story. He has a narrative in his mind that Ukraine is a place where the West is lining up their aggressive potential to be an existential threat to Russia and the future. And that Ukraine is a place of Nazification that is going to be a threat to their existence. Now, if you believe that, if that's what your narrative is, it could move you to move your armies to defend yourselves against that threat. And yet most of us, I think, have been reading and because of what we believe about democracy, freedom, tyrants, the ways of the world, history, we have another story, and we might be agreeing with Ukraine that it's our story to defend our country, our people, our fathers, our daughters, our families. And we haven't done anything to incur into their space, but they're invading ours, and we're going to fight until we die. Two different stories are at play here on the international scene, and it's been the story of most wars, past and ones that are still coming. Now, we have also national stories, and so they're sometimes unconscious. We don't quite know, or we're not aware of them all the time. And so I could just mention a name, and immediately an image or a story will come to your mind. Boris Johnson. Now, something obviously happened because I saw quite a few faces change and heard some laughs. But when I mention that name, an image comes to your mind. It might be one of, well, there are all kinds of images. I won't go there. But you're seeing a man, a politician, a person who's leading this country. You're thinking about the policies, how he sees the nation, the state of our economy today. You're thinking in this story about the future of Britain and its place in the world and in Europe. See, immediately, just a name can trigger that story or narrative that you have in your mind. Now, let's get a little bit more close to home. If I mention parents, there'll be a range in this church of what we think about parents. It could be a story of being fostered, an orphan, having a father who abandoned you, parents who didn't give you very much attention or ever express emotion, all the way to, I had a wonderful life. It could be that range of stories in your own life. And we carry those stories. We hold those stories. Now, the one problem is that the stories can sometimes hold us. So the story that Putin is believing is holding him and his nation right now and causing the horror that we see. The stories that we hold about our parents, about our upbringing, about God, about people, about the world, are sometimes holding us. And they're not complete stories. And this is what the Emmaus Road shows us today. So I'd like to read the story, and in between some of the verses, explain some more. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. Now, isn't this something? They knew Jesus. They knew what he looked like. They've walked with him. They've talked with him. They've eaten with him, and they couldn't recognize him. I think it's because of the narrative, the incomplete narrative they were holding. What had they wanted to see when Jesus came? What did they wanted to see him do in Jerusalem? What did they thought the Messiah would do when he came to the earth? Well, all of those things weren't happening the way they thought. And they were so sure of their narrative being true that they couldn't recognize Jesus right in front of them. And that's sometimes what happens to us. We have a certain story about life that we believe so strongly that Jesus could be standing right in front of us and we don't even recognize him. And that's one of the things that's happening in this story. And one of the things that we need to do as well is to learn to recognize Jesus, the fingerprints of God that are all around our lives. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" As if he didn't know. They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened here in these days?" And Jesus said, "What things?" And we know Jesus knows. They were all about him. And yet, God has a way of not intruding into our lives in ways that are, in ways that we wouldn't get, in ways that we wouldn't understand. He wants to know from them, what part of the story are you concerned about right now? And he wants to come in at that point. And that's what he wants to do with us. He wants to come in where you are right now, where I am right now, and deal with us at that place. So he says, okay, explain to me the things. What things are so important to you now? So moving your hearts. I want to enter there. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Debbie shared 2 weeks ago this idea that the disciples were looking for a savior like Moses, who would come in, call their names, get them going, lead them across the Red Sea, and deliver them into the promised land. All the promises about the Messiah were about a deliverance and even the cutting out of the oppression of the Roman occupation. That was what they'd hoped the Messiah was going to be able to do, to really restore all of the promises to Israel. And that hadn't happened with the one they thought was the Messiah. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they didn't see Jesus. On top of Jesus not meeting the expectations of their narrative, now they say, we're not even sure what happened. Is he dead? Is he alive? Did he disappear? Did someone steal him? They're confused about all that was happening. And this is what was animating their discussion on the road to Emmaus when Jesus walked up and asked them, what are you talking about? What things? And they just explained it to him. He said to them, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now, we're often encouraged that when we experience difficult things in our lives, it's said sometimes we know the end of the story, so we can hold on. We know what happens. We know the future, and we hold on until it comes. Interestingly, Jesus doesn't go to the future, but he goes back to the beginning. And he explains from Moses and all the prophets, and that's basically a reference to the Old Testament. He goes back in the story to tell them all the things that look forward to Jesus coming and it working out just like it happened. It wasn't a mistake. The narrative wasn't going sideways. Now, there's lots of places in the Old Testament where Jesus could have taken out a verse, a story, a person. What did he start with? How many things did he explain? It was enough for the writers of this story to say it was everything. I'm just going to choose 5 this morning to tell you. I think he went back to Genesis 3:15. Some people feel that that is the first gospel because it explains so much about God and the world today. In Genesis 3:15, God had just received Adam and Eve in front of him after they had eaten of the forbidden fruit, and was going to explain to the serpent who had just deceived Eve what the future was going to hold. And he says, I will put enmity. He's speaking to the serpent, which is Satan. I will put enmity. In other words, I will make war between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. You will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head. Now, why is that, those couple of lines of verse, so important and considered even the first gospel? And why did Jesus possibly go there? Because after the fall, after man decided to sin and rebel against God and choose another narrative, not God's narrative, God set in place something that would require suffering in order to get resurrection. Suffering in order to get salvation. And it's still a mystery to me of why God chose this way. But in his great wisdom, there was going to be trouble and strife and struggle in humans' lives between good and evil, between Satan and the Messiah, Christ, until he could restore all things. We sang songs this morning about restoration, and Simon mentioned that God is here to restore things in our lives. And this process or story of restoration has in it suffering and struggle, just like Barbara reminded us last week. And so there would be the ability for Satan to nip at the heel of Jesus and all of God's people. But that's all he could do. And he wouldn't have the power to destroy. And he wouldn't have the power to kill, because Jesus would be able to crush his head. And the serpent head is where he bites and where the venom and the poison is. And Jesus has the power to overcome that. So that was one place where I think the story started with Jesus and the disciples. And then how about Moses and the bronze serpent? This was a time in Israel's history when there were snakes in the camp. The snakes were biting people, probably on their feet, possibly on their hands. And they were dying because these were poisonous snakes. And as they were crying out to God for what to do, God told Moses, I want you to make a replica of a snake in bronze or copper, and I want you to put it on a pole, and I want you to lift it up. And when you do, and the people look on that, they will be saved, and they will be healed. Now, it is interesting to think about that story itself, about how Jesus later, it says in John, was to be lifted up like the snake on this pole. And when people looked at him, they would be saved. In other words, the power or the poison of Satan to destroy our lives and to cause death was defeated at Easter. That the power of death, the sting of death, like the sting of those snakes, was overcome by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that is how he would crush the head of Satan. I believe Jesus could have gone then to perhaps the story of Abraham and Isaac. What a heart-wrenching story when Abraham, who had the promise from God that he would be the father of many nations, was told by God to take his son Isaac and sacrifice him on an altar on the mountain. That would be the end to all of the promise that Abraham was holding. How could this be? And yet he was willing to do this in obedience to God. And of course, we know how that story ended as well, when God provided the sacrifice in the place of Isaac. And the disciples are remembering Genesis 3:15 about the serpent and the war between Satan and Jesus, evil and good. They're remembering about the bronze serpent in the history of Israel. And they're remembering about Abraham and the promise to him and how God provided a sacrifice. And they're starting to get it. Their narrative, their story of nothing working out when Jesus came is starting to get filled out again with the complete picture, as Jesus explains. I think he probably then could have gone to the story of Jonah while he's still explaining from the Old Testament. When Jonah, we won't go into the story now, was 3 days and nights in the belly of a whale. Wow, what a story. But then we're told that by Jesus himself, that as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and nights, the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and nights. And again, the disciples are seeing, we're getting it. We're seeing how all these things came together and that the story is working out just like God wanted it. I think he probably went to Isaiah, where we have some verses, many verses, but in chapter 53 in particular, about almost exactly what they've just experienced. However, it was our sicknesses that he himself bore, and our pains that he carried. Yet we ourselves assumed that he had been afflicted, struck down by God, and humiliated. But he was pierced for our offenses, crushed for our wrongdoings. The punishment for our well-being was laid upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. They're putting all of this together, and all the stories coming together now for them in a way that's more complete, more fitting with God's overall narrative of what is supposed to happen. And what they thought was a mistake in the coming of Jesus, not the fulfillment of the Messiah they'd expected, they're now beginning to see, no, this is it. He is the one. The story is taking place. It is going to happen like he said. We could keep on going with the Passover lamb, stories from Hosea, the Psalms, but whatever Jesus told them in those moments, they were changed. Their narrative was complete. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "No, stay with us. It's early evening. The day's almost over." So he went in to stay with them. It's interesting to think that Jesus was pretending to go on farther. And he probably would have told them something like, "I've got my relatives in such and such a village," or "I have a plan to see so-and-so." But they wanted him to stay. He'd just been telling them the fulfillment of all of the great story of God. They wanted more. And he comes in. We often have to invite Jesus into our lives, just like what happened here. It's not just the first time that you ever meet Jesus. We need to continue to be inviting him in. And instead of waiting only for the prayer time at the end of the service, where you could come forward and pray with people to invite Jesus into your life, I would just like to stop right now. And in a moment of quiet, eyes open or closed, I just would ask you to invite Jesus in again, wherever you need him to be right now, and I will do the same. May he come. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he disappeared from their sight. You know, the life of following Jesus is full of wonder, thrill, joy, and mystery, and paradox, and difficulty. So just when Jesus is recognized by them, and they're so filled with joy, he disappears. And our lives are like that too, aren't they? Which is why we need to continue to restory our lives, that it continually fits in with God's story. They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. Their lives were completely turned around. They'd left Jerusalem where everything was happening and where Jesus was, and were headed back home, dejected and defeated. They turned around at once and went back to Jerusalem. They wanted to be with their brothers and sisters. They wanted to be a part of the story again. They found that the 11 and those with them assembled together were saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen, and he's appeared to Simon." And then these two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. We did that this morning. We shared in communion and broke the bread. And whenever we do this, we remember Jesus. We remember the whole story. We can have another opportunity to turn our lives around, to repent, and to fit our lives in with his and his story. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace with you." They were startled and frightened. The story goes back and forth, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It's me. Touch me and see. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones, as you see I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" This wonderful, amazing, gripping story, and God is so in touch in little details and in real life. "Hey, can we have some breakfast? I haven't eaten since I disappeared from their house last night." He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the Old Testament." Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. And he told them, this is the whole gathered crowd, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. And repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all the nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I'm going to send you what my Father has promised. Stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." This is the story of God on this planet, in this universe. And it's our story as we've decided to follow Jesus and believe in him. We need this continual restoring of our lives to be able to fit his story. And the way it happened here with the disciples on the Emmaus Road is they listened to Jesus, they invited him in, they recognized him involved in their lives, and they decided to turn around and head back and to be with him. And this is what we need. So may we all here at St. Andrew's continue to listen to Jesus, be aware of his presence, talk about him with each other, share the remembrance in communion, invite him into everything, recognize him in all parts of our life, that we might restore our lives to fit in his wonderful restoration story called salvation.